Why are people returning their Apple Vision Pros? The answer is simple. The return window is up, right? End of video. Thanks for watching.
The thing we've really spent the last week kind of discovering as a society is that it turns out that Apple, having a long history of making these things work and having a presumably very cool roadmap, doesn't mean anything for the thing on your face, right? Like, this is what we talked about when we did this review, right? Like, you can talk all you want about where this is going and who's right about the future and the big ideas behind all of this and Apple's ability to execute. And I still have not changed my mind on any of that. I think if you were to bet on a horse in this race, you'd be crazy not to bet on Apple. Just historically, that is true. It doesn't change anything for the fact that you just bought a very expensive thing that is uncomfortable to wear for a lot of people, doesn't do that much for most people's use cases, and is $3,500. And so I think...
So, big surprise. The reason people are returning their Apple Vision Pro is because it doesn't have a killer app. This is very clearly my hobby horse, right? But I think that it is born true over many generations of the paradigms of computing that we've had. So I don't know why you'd stop now in terms of evaluating things this way, right? So I want to start by talking about that history, something I've covered before, but something that I feel like if I don't talk about now, I would be remiss. So when I think about the arc towards what we are calling spatial computing, you start with the personal computer, right? The Apple II, right? It was the first real appliance computer, and it was aimed at a market for people who would have computers in their home for the first time. Instead of getting this giant room full of like vacuum tubes or tape that you'd have or punch cards that control the thing, you type onto a little terminal and there was just enough power in the microprocessor to do things on its own. And this was the iteration. It was the Apple II because it was an iteration on the Apple I. The Apple I was very clearly marketed only to enthusiasts, right? It was basically launched in a little homebrew group to a bunch of their buddies, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. The Apple II was the idea of the Apple II was to take that and package it and polish it and let it be a product that was good enough to kind of make it into the home or make it into the business, right? The reality was at the beginning that the first customers were still pretty much the same customers that bought the Apple I, enthusiasts, developers. They're kind of that original homebrew group that the Apple I was originally marketed towards. What about the Mac? Now, the Mac had the core innovation of making the graphical user interface into a product, right? It took the research from Xerox PARC and turned it into something that was accessible to the end user. And there's this really famous quote where I think it's Steve Jobs talking about how over time, the amount of computing power used in a device is less for the computing itself and more to adapt the computer to the end user, to the human interface, right? And the Mac was a perfect example of that. Instead of using that extra computing power in the Mac to do more calculations on a command line, they used it to make a graphical simulation of an office and used metaphors that were familiar to people to make computers more accessible to people. And in doing so, they aimed for a market of, again, the home. And at the beginning, they did a little bit of that. It was launched to great fanfare, but the ultimate market that the Mac initially launched for was, again, enthusiasts and developers who recognized the power of a graphical user interface and what a computer could do now that it had that graphical user interface. The key idea was to make the computer for the rest of us. But before it was the computer for the rest of us, it had to be the computer for the developers that would make it useful enough for the rest of us. What about the iPhone? The iPhone is a special case. I've covered this before. I will cover it again. The iPhone was an application, a killer application in itself. It learned a lot of the lessons from the Apple II and from the Mac and from the iMac and from the iPod and took over a market that already existed, the phone market and the MP3 market, which Apple was already owned at that time, right? And people bought it just for that case because it was a great phone and it was a great iPod, and that was enough. Now, for the Apple II and for the Mac, that wasn't the case at the beginning. Remember, the people who were buying the iPhone was, yes, the enthusiast probably at the beginning, but everyone understood why you'd buy the iPhone at the beginning, because it was a good phone and because it was a good iPod. With the Mac, it's less so the case. Well, why am I buying this thing? What's the point, right? With the Apple II, even more so, I don't even know how to use it. Why am I buying this thing? What's the point? And so that brings us forward to the iPad, right? The iPad, people mocked for being just a big iPhone. And Steve had a rationale for why the iPad should exist, which was ultimately consumption at the time. Reading the web, watching videos, looking at photos. It was sort of the armchair computer, the thing that you'd use to lean back and do your computing needs, maybe send off an email or two in the evening, right? Over time, that iPad evolved and had broader aspirations for the future of personal computing, which was to take over the market essentially from the Mac. Whether that's truly the case is still debated, but it at least had aspirations to be a suitable replacement for the Mac for maybe a bigger majority of people because it had the human interface necessary for it, the touch screen, and eventually the keyboard and mouse and pencil. The problem with the iPad is that it also didn't have a killer app. Its closest thing was that it was able to run a bunch of iPhone software, but in the long term, people just didn't get it, right? And the developers were not willing to do it. Like, to this day, there's no Instagram app for the iPad still, which is kind of amazing to think about, right? Whereas, that was a no-brainer for the iPhone at the time. I tell this story because it makes me wonder about when people buy a product for a particular use case. I've said this from the first video that I made, right? That people buy things because they do something. They don't buy them necessarily because they're cool. Early adopters buy things because they're cool, but the bulk of the market doesn't care. They really don't care. So the question is whether Apple should be concerned about these returns of Apple Vision Pro. And, it's way too early. We don't know the data. There's barely any market research about what's actually happening there. My guess is the answer is no. It's probably relatively small. They're still back-ordered. There's not a lot to be worried about here. It's just overblown stories for a new product. But I think the question and people's interest in that question gets at a larger idea here, which is, who is the Apple Vision Pro for? And why is it missing its killer app is, I guess, the secondary question there. Now, Apple has a long history of choosing markets for its devices. Again, the Apple II was supposed to be for the general user, but it was ultimately for hobbyists, right? The Mac was supposed to be for knowledge workers, but it was ultimately for hobbyists at the beginning, right? Even the Lisa, which preceded the Mac, was supposed to be for the office worker and ultimately was an extremely expensive device that was for developers for the Mac eventually, right? What about the Apple Vision Pro? Who is this thing for? Well, one thing to note when we ask that question is when it was announced. It was most likely announced or it was announced during WWDC, most likely because it was targeted to developers, right? Apple's developer conference, it makes sense that they'd be launching this to developers. And kind of a common refrain that people have had is that, well, this is just a developer kit, basically. It's a pretty expensive developer kit. And the more I use the device, the more I think that this is the case. And the more I think we can nail down the idea that this ultimately, the target market for this device, supply constrained to less than $1 million in the first year, extremely expensive, lacking apps. It's going to be the same market that the Mac launched to, that the Apple II launched to, that the Lisa launched to, that the Apple I launched to, and basically everything except for the iPod and the iPhone launched to, which is that enthusiast, Apple fanboy market. So if we think that that's the case, And if we kind of read into that idea that the Vision Pro was launched to developers, the question is whether that's enough. Now, I think we can learn a lot from the history there, right? In the past, every one of those major computing platforms, except for the iPhone, was launched and was initially embraced by enthusiasts before it went out to the broader market. With the Apple II, as I've talked about in the past, enthusiasts bought it, and they, within a year, were making the first spreadsheet for a computer, which sold that computer to small businesses, right? So enthusiasts bought the computer first. They built apps for that computer because they saw what it could do and thought about the potential market for it. And then eventually, that application, the killer app, sold it to a broader market. Because that's what a killer app is. It's the thing that sells the device. Because people buy computers for what they can do, not for the product itself. The broader market. We're not talking about enthusiasts here. With the Mac, that was PageMaker and desktop publishing, right? People bought the Mac, enthusiasts bought the Mac at the beginning because it was a great thing, and they saw this shiny new product in the core product that could do something. And eventually, over time, someone, again, I think within the first year, made an app for it that then the desktop publishing industry realized that they could utilize. And so the pattern repeats itself over and over and over again until you get to the iPhone. And people want to compare this thing to the iPhone because guess what? That was the latest big hit that Apple had. But this thing is not like the iPhone. I just want to underscore that. It is not like the iPhone. People are not buying the Vision Pro because it's replacing something directly in their life. Every person that has bought a Vision Pro probably already has a Mac, probably already has an iPad, probably already has an iPhone, or at least some combination of those things, right? It's not replacing any of those things, not the beginning. They're buying it because they think it's an interesting piece of technology and it's a fun toy to play with, right? Guess what that market is? It's the enthusiasts, it's the developers. And the question is whether spatial computing as a paradigm shift is foundational enough of a paradigm shift to spur new applications that otherwise could not have existed. I think this is something that we're going to have to continue exploring over a longer period of time, but that is the ultimate question. Is the paradigm shift to spatial computing enough of a paradigm shift that it will enable applications that you cannot do on your iPad, that you cannot do on your iPhone, that you cannot do on your laptop? And at this point, I don't know that anyone's convinced of that yet. There's a lot that's going on, but floating apps out in the world may or may not be enough. I have talked about one killer app potentially being the multi-pad lifestyle, that you can have essentially a bunch of iPad floating in front of you in an array of ways that lets you see a bunch of information all at once. It's the best of the Mac with the best of the iPad. That might be true, but the Mac can kind of do that too, right? You can essentially run Mac apps on the iPad, run iPad apps on the Mac for free. Most developers let you do that. So whether that's enough of a paradigm shift, I think is the question here. Now, there's a great series of posts from Stratechery and Ben Thompson over there at Stratechery talking about why Apple doesn't foster a healthy developer ecosystem, starting with the iPhone, right? And I want to dig into this more in the future, but I wanted to give a little bit of a taster here. And he talks a lot about Apple's history there, right? One of the first companies to develop software for the Mac was Microsoft. They developed Excel for the Mac before they developed it for the PC, because guess what? The Mac preceded the PC, right? And Microsoft was a software company. And look what happened there. Apple eventually had a near-death experience because Microsoft squeezed Apple out of the market, and Apple was poorly managed at that point. And so deep down, a lot of the old guard of Apple, which still is around at the company, many of them are at least, right, feel that being beholden to a outside software maker is one of the biggest threats to their business. John Siracusa talks about this too with IBM and Xerox and all these companies losing the linchpin of control over their platform, right? Apple thinks that software distribution is the linchpin of control, which is why the App Store was such a big innovation for them, and why it was the thing that continues to define a lot of the company's biggest struggles. Because number one, it's their biggest golden goose. Number two, it's the thing that sells their products. People buy iPhones because you can do something with them, and the way you do something with them is get an app through the App Store. And number three, it's the biggest issue for them. They are facing a ton of regulatory scrutiny across the world that they now have to bat down, not to mention the poor developer relations that have been borne out because of the tight control, the tyrannical control that Apple has over the App Store. So back to Ben Thompson, he talks about why that lack of desire to allow these app makers to build sustainable and really thriving businesses basically is the thing that stifled the iPad's growth, right? The iPad can only do so much because Apple had too much control over software distribution. And I think that speaks to a lot of it, right? The Apple Vision Pro is kind of touted as a successor to the Mac, a potential successor to the Mac. It's the first true multi-window operating system that that Apple has created since Mac OS, right? And people are talking about it in that way. The main difference between this thing and the other thing is that Apple Vision Pro is tightly controlled in terms of its software distribution. Probably a lot of the reason for that is because Apple wants that linchpin of control under their supervision. On the other hand, on the Mac, you've got this open distribution system with a lot of checks on that open distribution, but the history of the Mac has been this vibrant developer community that surrounds it because they could define their customer relationship, because they had more options for distribution and beyond. So, bottom line, we'll dig into that more later, but bottom line, people are returning to this thing because there's a gap between expectations and reality. Expectations are not fulfilled because the apps are not there, and the apps are not there because Apple is fearful of losing a linchpin of control and losing the revenue related to that linchpin of control. And that linchpin of control is the App Store. Whether or not that will prove to be a big enough roadblock to prevent this thing from taking off is still to be seen. But at the moment, people aren't buying it because the apps aren't there. And the apps aren't there because the developers just, A, probably haven't had enough time, and B, because it's just, they have a lot of fear from the past, the same way that Apple has a lot of fear from the past too.